Welcome, everyone. So I thought that I would give some real talk about physical health after awakening. So this is partially in response to the last video that I did talking about acute illness and spiritual awakening. Like, why might people during spiritual awakening get all sorts of acute illnesses and physical happenings overall? So I received a few notes and letters, emails that I will share. One from a person sharing that she's been undergoing a Kundalini awakening for 10 years and she still feels like crap. Those are her words. And so she's kind of wondering why. Another person shared their confusion and their story about having an initial spiritual teacher that taught them that their method was a way to increase physical health and stamina, but that then that teacher fell sick and passed away, and so that led him to feeling quite confused and wondering what the reality is regarding what can be achieved in terms of physical health and spiritual awakening. And the last one that I will read out loud, which is, what are the typical outcomes for physical health following awakening? Is it a return to homeostasis and normal functioning, less than typical health, given the stress is so extreme at points for most, or a movement towards supernormal levels of health, immune function, cognition, memory, hormonal and exercise capacity, and energy levels? So I thought I'd offer some real talk about what can be expected in regards to physical health after awakening. And so one of the ways that spiritual awakening is marketed is by saying that if only you are spiritual enough, you will be healthy, wealthy, and wise. You will have a yacht if you only think right. You will have not only incredible health, but maybe you'll even become immortal. All of this sort of stuff is present in the literature, and we love it. It sells really well. And so I would say about 99% of what is out there is not what happens in regards to physical health following spiritual awakening. Somebody may have experienced a spiritual awakening and be completely what we might call spiritually awakened, completely conscious, be at the end of their path where they're no longer seeking, and they can still have physical as well as emotional health difficulties. For example, I'm not talking about mental health today, but there are plenty of teachers out there who still sometimes struggle with depression, or PTSD or CPTSD. And they may have come light years in terms of their healing, in terms of how they relate to their mind, but that does not mean that they would still do not have a tendency towards whatever mental health difficulties or emotional difficulties that they do. The problem with the physical health thing and how it is sold, that if only you are spiritual enough, if only you are enlightened enough, you will be perfectly physically well, or maybe you'll even become immortal, is that there is that kernel of truth there. So I will tell you what I have observed in the modern world, in myself, as well as in my studies, as well as now working with people all across the spectrum of the spiritual path for 20 some odd years now, which is that what changes isn't necessarily physical health. Let's talk about how and why physical health actually changes for people who are undergoing or experiencing spiritual awakening. So one of the things that is really helpful to understand is that we get in our own ways a lot. We sabotage ourselves a lot. There's a reason why collectively we all create New Year's resolutions and then we never carry them out. There's a reason why we reach for the food that we do, why we have the lifestyle that we do. And so if we look at it from that angle, I will say that one of the things that happens during spiritual awakening that does dramatically shift physical health is that when you are willing to or go through a process of healing past trauma, healing emotions that kind of linger in the body, and looking directly at things like ignorance and self-hatred, self-loathing, what happens is that all of the behavioral ways that we seek to numb ourselves, that we seek to kind of show our self-loathing or self-hatred towards ourselves start disappearing. And so what that means is that plenty of people come to me and they're like, you know what, I've realized for a long time that my drinking, my wine usage, my addictions to food and otherwise were not serving me. But yet every time I get stressed out, I notice myself, you know, eating all these carbs or reaching for that glass of wine or something like that. And so, what happens following awakening is that you are aware of these tendencies in yourself. And because there are not so many emotions to numb or to get rid of, they can simply be felt and experienced. What happens is that naturally the ways in which we sabotage ourselves, in which we show kind of our own self-hatred, start to disappear. So we it is much easier for us to take care of ourselves, to develop a healthier lifestyle, healthier diet, healthier exercise routine, or exercise routine overall. And this is for a couple of different reasons. And the first is like, just like I mentioned, that those self-loathing tendencies can be looked at, those emotions that are holding us back or sabotaging ourselves start to disappear. The other reason is that when you become more conscious, you become much more aware of what is going on in your sphere and how it affects you. So, one of the things that I talk about people with quite a bit is that people often make dietary changes during spiritual awakening. However, this typically isn't because of ideology. That is where people may start out, where mentally, um, ideologically, they seek a more balanced diet, a diet that does less harm. They know that they should exercise in order to keep themselves healthy, or maybe their doctor or somebody else has, told them that they need to exercise, all of that sort of stuff. But what happens when spiritually awakening and after spiritual awakening is that you have an acute sense of what sitting around all day does to your body. You have an acute sense of what happens if you eat a whole bag of potato chips or crisps, depending on where you're living. You have an acute sense of what happens to you if you participate in life versus not participating in life. If you're sitting around watching TV all day, getting high, versus, doing something that is creative and loving and brings something into this world. You have a sense of, how meditation may affect you. So we can go on down the list. But what happens is that this is a sense of your own energy and how it is affected by your choices that people may, in different states of lesser consciousness, not pay attention to. So I would say after awakening, people do become healthier because there isn't that emotional emptiness, there isn't that spiritual emptiness that is driving people to self-sabotage. And there's an awareness energetically, emotionally, spiritually, on all levels of how certain choices in our lives affect us on a, I would say, on a cellular level, on an energetic level, on an emotional level, on a physical level. So in that case, it is very true that people do become healthier during spiritual awakening. And again, it isn't an ideological thing. It is more of a, oh wow, I used to be able to eat a whole bag of, candy, and now when I do, I really, really don't feel well. And so what happens is that you stop eating that whole bag of candy. Let's also talk about mentality because this is a huge difference in somebody who is awakened versus somebody who may be awakening, kind of going through that process of awakening. One of the things that tends to happen is that post-awakening, there is still pain, there is still disease, there is still dysfunction, but your relationship to it changes. And what happens in kind of, other stages of consciousness is that we tend to disparage ourselves for being sick or not feeling well or not feeling like doing something. We very much live in a culture where we've been very much conditioned to believe that we should always be doing something. And so it can kind of vary person to person, but the amount of people I've talked to who yell at themselves for being sick or not feeling well, or, maybe spending a Sunday resting, rather than getting everything on their to-do list done. That mentality tends to disappear because that conditioning is seen through. And so what that means is that there can be an understanding that states of being, states of stillness, states of rest are as important as states of doing. They're simply, two sides of the same coin. And as a culture, we are very much stuck in the polarity, in the head-based polarity of always thinking, always doing, always seeking action. And so when that is seen through, somebody is able to rest without sort of lambasting themselves for needing rest. The other aspect of things, which is a huge thing, which is that if we tend to have pain, illness, or dysfunction in our bodies, is that we have a tendency to go at war with ourselves. We may feel all sorts of emotional ways about it. We may, again, talk poorly to ourselves about being sick or being in pain. And we do not wish to accept the reality that we are in pain. And so this is one of the biggest ways that spiritual sort of culture has skewed and sort of sold back this mentality in a disingenuous way, because what what I might call popularized spirituality sells people is the myth that if they're only spiritual, they would never be in pain again. When the truth is that your relationship with pain changes. When you accept that you are in pain, when you accept that you are sick, you can have a much different relationship with it, and the outcomes typically tend to go better than if you are constantly at war with yourself. They've done a lot of studies on this as well. Like, what is that person that is constantly fighting themselves, when they experience some pain versus somebody who has the capacity in a really meditative way to be like, you know what? I feel pain and it sucks, but let me actually go into the pain and accept the pain, rather than denying it, rather than, trying to push it away, rather than trying to be at war at it. And so this is the biggest difference between somebody who kind of post-awakening versus somebody who may still be in earlier stages of awakening, is that acceptance of even kind of the extremes of the physical body. And you may see this with people practicing things in really cold temperatures or really hot temperatures, and, regulating their body, or, kind of transcending the feelings and emotional realities that come with it. And so that is kind of more of the truth of the matter, is that going into acceptance of everything that goes on in your body doesn't mean you have to like it, doesn't mean you have to love it. It just means that there is full and total acceptance of it and a going into it instead of a denying it, or shaming yourself for it. Those tend to drastically shift outcomes, as well as how we feel about ourselves, as well as the trajectory of our health overall. Basically, if I were to give an example, somebody saying, "Oh, I can't get sick. I'm not going to get sick. I'm not getting a cold. I'm not getting a cold. I'm such a terrible person because I'm getting a cold. I'm exhausted and can't get a cold right now." That person is likely to have a cold that lasts for a long time. The person who recognizes that they are getting sick and takes care of themselves, physically, nutritionally, emotionally, accepting, yeah, I'm getting sick. I need to take extra care for myself. How can I be compassionate and loving to myself during this time, is going to have a much different experience of that cold. And so the last thing that I will talk about is that we live in a very death-denying culture. And so this is perfect for all of those books out there that say that, if you're only spiritual enough, you will not get sick, you will not die, all of that sort of thing. We very much like to listen to our fears and, listen to false prophets, so to say, rather than really digging into our fears, our experiences of reality. So basically, we're looking for a panacea, or what we want to hear, instead of what might be true, or what might allow for us to become a bit more conscious. And so, on a deep level, or not so deep for some of us, we have an awareness that things are impermanent. Put more simply, all of us could step out on the street and be run over flat by a truck, 2 minutes from now. And we do not like to sit with this awareness, with this uncertainty, because it introduces the awareness of death, the awareness of our own impermanence, the awareness that we are only in physical bodies for what amounts to a very short period of time. And so, what happens when somebody has sat with and accepted these things? That there's only so much that we can control regarding our physical health. I have worked with people that have had the perfect diet, the perfect lifestyle, and still have gotten sick. And some of them have rightfully been very, very angry about it. Um, and I have worked with people who, have had nothing but a diet of, pretzels and, cherry Coke, and they live to be, 95 years old and in good health. So there is a level of uncertainty and a lack of control that comes with really reckoning with our existence. And a big part of it is accepting uncertainty, accepting how much control we lack, and accepting the reality of our physical death. And so, what happens if we sit with layers and layers of this? If we go into this instead of deny it or pretend like if we only think right, that we will become immortal or we'll never have a health issue again, is that we can accept our physical deaths. We can accept whatever physical illness comes up. We can have grace for ourselves when those things do inevitably happen. No matter how spiritual we are, no matter how strong we are, no matter how our mentalities are, we all live in physical bodies that at certain ages are going to um, lose kind of muscle tone, that are going to lose mass, that are going to go through a process of aging. That includes the brain, that includes the body. Are there much are there ways in which we can much better take care of ourselves and ensure that our minds and our bodies stay healthy and well? Yes. Um, you know, but there is a certain amount of acceptance that is needed, that we do live in bodies that essentially do fall apart, and the uncertainty of all of existence, and essentially control. So, um, and what I will say is, if you haven't already turned this off because you don't want to hear this stuff, is that what happens when you really examine your fear of death, if you really sit with it and accept it in all different levels, is that what comes up is curious. It is a fear of life. It is a fear of truly living. And this is sort of the bottom of the ocean to meet the ocean floor of all ocean floors, as I would say it. And what that means is that most of us are so used to being depleted. Most of us are so used to being in a place of death denial that we never really live our lives. We have a fear of our own energy. We have a fear of our own vitality. We have a fear of our own power, which is essentially our vitality, our creativity, feeling in full flow through our bodies. And so when you can recognize this fear, that the fear isn't truly about death, it is about life, it is about living, that again can be something that can be confronted. And so what happens when this fear is confronted, the fear of life, is that you do, well, let me break it up a little bit more. When you are willing to accept totally the fear of death, what happens is that you begin to realize that we are only here for a finite amount of time. You contend with uncertainty of existence, and that we only have so much control over our physical health. And so what happens when you contend with those things is that you start doing things that when you are in a death denying state that you normally wouldn't, because you recognize that there is not much time left, so to speak. Even if you're talking about the span of, like, even if you have 50, 60, 70 years left, the way things are going, maybe 100 years, that's still, in the grand scheme of eternity, isn't a large amount of time. And so when the reality of death is truly accepted, somebody starts doing all of those things, or many of them, that they've sort of put off. What would really allow for them to, do that? And so when the fear of life is confronted, somebody has the energy and has gotten out of their own way enough to put their life force energy where they choose. And so that means that the chaos tends to move out of our lives, the distractions, all of that stuff tends to move away. And so what happens is a purposeful deciding where to put your energy, what to do with your life. And this becomes a conscious choice when it was not as much before. And so somebody who has gone through the process of spiritual awakening will have more energy, will have more vitality, and will tend to have greater health in some regards because they have more energy flowing through their system. They have worked through the emotional, energetic, physical reasons why they block themselves from physical wellness. Does that mean that somebody who, is in a wheelchair with a, busted C3 is gonna, start walking again or anything like that? No, it doesn't. Does it mean perfect health, perfect wealth? No, of course not. What it means is that there is a recognition of the energy that you have, a treating that of precious, and a utilizing of that when and how you can in a purposeful way. So if we go back to the basic question, does spiritual awakening lead to physical wellness, essentially? And the kernel of truth in that is yes. However, it is a bit different than what is being marketed. And the real nuanced area is that somebody after awakening may still have physical, emotional struggles, imbalances within themselves that but their mentality towards them, the way that they treat themselves, the way that they integrate those into their lives is going to be much different than somebody who is still at a point of death and disease denying or self-hatred, self-loathing to themselves in general or in regards to any physical, emotional, spiritual health difficulties they may have. The last thing that I will mention, because one of the letters did mention brain health, which is that what we know about our brains over time is that when we are quite young, our brains go through what is known as pruning. Essentially, this is like we have all of the potential in the world, and our brain creates all of these different roads. And when we are growing up, we have a tendency to explore all of these different roads, all of these different pathways in our mind that lead us to all different thoughts, all different experiences of reality, to consider one thing over another and then to maybe change our minds again. As we get older, what tends to happen is that some of those roads shut down. We may even be in such a state where we have like essentially one super highway, and that is all we go down again and again. It is just one thought, one feeling, one way of looking at reality. The benefit of spiritually awakening, if somebody is truly going through a state where their consciousness is evolving, is that all of those roads that have gone dark can be explored again. There can be a recognition that there is not one way of being, not one way of thinking, not one, whatever you want to put it, that is correct. There is not one fundamental way of being or thinking that is the right path, so to speak. And so when somebody recognizes that, they can move into expanded states where their brains can have so many different roads. They can have different interests. They could go explore. If they have the finances, they can travel. They can listen to opinions that are different than their own. Most of us tend to shut down all the roads in our minds because at some point we determine this is my life, this is reality, this is how I'm going to think, and I'm going to shut out absolutely everything else and everyone else that isn't like me and doesn't think like me. Somebody that is truly going through a state of spiritual awakening where they experience that expansion and evolution of mind will be open to the humanity of others. They will see themselves in every person they meet, no matter how they think. And so that lights up all of those different roads, which can be extraordinarily good for brain health, is to, do things like take up a new hobby, to listen to something outside of your domain, to travel, to do something that is outside of the typical routine of thought and behavior. And so somebody who has been going through spiritual awakening is much more likely to have a brain where those roads either haven't closed down or they have reopened. And so that leads to greater brain elasticity, greater brain health, and greater curiosity for the world, greater acceptance of the wonder and whimsy and all that sort of stuff of the world. This is partially why In some literature regarding spiritual awakening, they talk about people returning to a childlike state because as children, we still are testing our boundaries. We are still looking at the world as a place of discovery, as one that can be filled with whimsy and laughter and wonder and magic. And so our minds can very much return to that state instead of, being in a state where we tend to become more negative as we get older, as, our roads sort of close down. So I hope that that helps, and that leaves something to the conversation. It is a nuanced area, and the short answer is, yes, but in terms of physical health, physical wellness regarding spiritual awakening.